I want to welcome you to a webinar on credentials and adult education and literacy. I'm Anson Green, the State Director of Adult Education and Literacy at the Texas Workforce Commission. And before we begin, I want to remind everybody that we have a wide variety of technical resources, policy guidance, and webinars, all located on the Resources and Webinars webpage of the TCAL website at the URL listed on the screen. I also want to advise everybody, because some of this guidance is rather technical and some of the policy is new and sometimes somewhat complicated. And I really encourage everyone to send questions that you have to the email address listed here, aelta@twc.state.tx.us. For this webinar, I suggest some prerequisites before you really begin to digest the content. One of those prerequisites would be the AEL letter 0119 on periods of participation, and the other one would be the AEL letter 0118, change 1, entitled Educational Outcomes in Adult Education and Literacy. Both of those letters lay out in detail kind of the policy framework and methodologies behind performance for measurable skills gain, as well as the credential attainment measure, which we'll be focusing on in this webinar. There are also some other videos that would be very useful to review. Several videos on the resource and webinar website on measurable skills gains, one for each of the different measurable skills gain measures, and then webinars also on POPs, periods of participation. The one entitled The Basics, Understanding Periods of Participation, provides kind of a foundational framework for this new method of calculating performance periods for adult education students. So let's begin with a little overview of the WIOA performance measures. As we're probably very well aware, there are different federal measures for measurable skills gains, different employment measures, including an earnings measure, and then the credential attainment measure. These measures are very important for us to consider in the context of whether they are reviewed and measured while a student is in participation or after the student has exited. The other federal measure is effectiveness in serving employers, which has 3 different components. And then there are some state measures that we measure for the Legislative Budget Board and for our legislature. But if you notice within these measures, most of them, except for the measurable skills gain measure, are listed as post-exit measures. And this becomes very important as you start to think about a student's participation and their performance, as well as when you review performance that you receive from us on how your program is doing. When something is listed as a post-exit measure, that means the calculation for the measure doesn't begin until the student actually exits your program. So when you look at a measurement for employment or for credential attainment, for example, you won't see a GED or high school equivalency test show up in your performance, or you won't see that someone was able to get a job through your program while the student is enrolled in the program. Those calculations only begin once the student is exited from the program. So it could be very much the case in an adult education program that a student is in the program for 2 years. And if they earned a credential in the first year, continuous performance, they never exited, they never went 90 days without a service, you wouldn't see that credential year 1, then you would not see it until they exit in year 2. So there's oftentimes what we call lag in the measures. And if you hear the term, it's a lag measure, or there's lag in that measure, that means the calculation period of it is sometimes drawn out, oftentimes triggered only after an individual exits. So let's move on to the credential attainment measure itself. The credential attainment measure is really one measure that has 2 different methods to earn performance within it. One of those methods is a recognized post-secondary credential that can be earned through a student that's in an integrated education and training program. And the second method is a high school equivalency award that is made for an individual that earns a high school equivalency. Let's talk about the high school equivalency first. The high school equivalency in Texas has 2 options by which to earn it. And in Texas, an individual that earns a high school equivalency actually earns a certificate of high school equivalency from the Texas Education Agency. So the GED test or the HiSET test 2 different vendors that are authorized in the state of Texas to offer high school equivalency services. Those vendors distribute and disseminate their own tests throughout the state, and then those state scores go to the Texas Education Agency, where the education agency reviews them and awards the individual that took the test an actual certificate of high school equivalency, often called the Tex Chase certificate. So 2 options in Texas for 1 high school equivalency certificate. The high school equivalency is also unique in that as a award, it can count for both the credential attainment measure, which we're talking about in this webinar, or as a measurable skills gain measure, which we've talked about in other webinars. So 1 credential can get 2 points of performance for an individual that's in an adult education and literacy program. But the criteria for each one of those is different. So let me explain. For a high school equivalency as a measurable skills gain, this has unique qualities. First, this is known as the Type 2 Basic Education MSG. And as a reminder, there's a whole webinar dedicated simply on that one MSG measure. And here the criteria is that it's an interim measure that's during participation. Remember, the measurable skills gains are not post-exit or exit-based, but they're measured during participation. So if a student earns a high school equivalency while they're in your program, you're going to see that show up in a performance report as soon as that data is entered into Teams and we produce that performance report. It's also recognized in English and Spanish language. So individuals in Texas can take a high school equivalency in Spanish. For example, they could be an ESL student that may be even at a very low level, but they have a very high degree of skill in Spanish and they take their high school equivalency in Spanish. That can count as a measurable skills gain in Texas, and it can also count as a credential, as we'll see. But on the performance measure for credential under the high school equivalency achievement measurable skills gain, this has to be earned during participation and before the end of the program year. So the period of performance is during that program year and during participation. And that's where you're going to see it differ from high school equivalency as a credential attainment measure. I want to also mention that this measure for measurable skills gain is matched every night through a data match with the Texas Education Agency database. And here, as many of you are aware, having the correct information on the individual that is in your program and that the individual uses the same information when they register for their high school equivalency test is extremely important. The name, the date of birth, and the Social Security number, if available, are all areas that we match with TEA's data batch to make sure that we have a connectivity with the student in terms of performance. A common mistake is individuals that have hyphens or spaces or capitalization in their name. And so in this example here, De La Cruz can be written 3 different ways. And if an individual writes it one way and you enter it into Teams that way, but then they go take a high school equivalency and enter it a different way, or the high school equivalency administrator enters it differently, that's going to cause a mismatch between the database that will cause us to have to do some extra work to try to remediate that. So that's a little bit of background on the basic education MSG using the credential high school equivalency. Now let's think of high school equivalency as a credential attainment measure. Here the criteria is different. So under the credential attainment measure for high school equivalency, the period of performance is the period of participation of the individual or within 1 year after exiting. So an individual can gain a high school equivalency while they're in your program, but once they leave, there's still a whole year, 365 days, that they have to finish that high school equivalency. So it's oftentimes the case that an individual's with you, they pass 1 test, 2 tests, they pass all but one of their final test, and then they leave and they go, well, I'm going to go take my math test tonight, for example. They leave and take the math test, but they never come back because you assume they've passed it and you don't know. But as long as it's within 365 days, if they pass that high school equivalency, you will get credit for that individual, and you don't have to do any extra work because we'll be matching it every night with the Texas Education Agency. So just like with the measurable skills gain, the high school equivalency can be in English or Spanish, and it can be in-state or it can be an out-of-state credential. In terms of the denominator, I want to stress that the denominator for this credential attainment measure component is non-high school complete students, so individuals that don't have a diploma and don't have an equivalency, and they're at the adult secondary level, 5 or 6, on all domains at any time during their period of participation. So if they begin at a level 4 in all domains, and then they progress into a 5 or 6 in all domains during that POP, then they become part of the denominator for the credential attainment measure. So it is either being at a 5 or 6 in all domains at any time during the POP, or if a participant takes and passes at least one section of a high school equivalency exam in Spanish or English. So in that example, sometimes the student may be at a level 4 in all domains, but if they go take and pass a test, then they will enter the denominator also. Similarly, they may be an ESL student at level 2 or level 1, and if they take a Spanish high school equivalency and pass it, they will enter the denominator for the performance of a grant recipient. In terms of getting a credit for credential attainment for the HSC, one of the differences between HSC as a measurable skills gain and HSC as a credential is that not only does an individual have to pass the high school equivalency, but they must also enter post-secondary education or be employed in one of the 4 calendar quarters following exit. So until that happens, the grant recipient will not get credit for the credential attainment measure. All right, let's move our attention to post-secondary credentials. Again, the post-secondary credential descriptions in quite a bit of detail are listed in the letter of 0118, AEL letter 0118 change 1, or if you have doubts, always ask an AEL staff member, including myself. So recognized post-secondary credentials include 5 different major categories of credentials. Industry recognized occupational certificates or certifications, apprenticeship certificates of completion, occupational licenses, state recognized occupational credit certificates and degrees, and recognized non-credit continuing education credentials. Each of those 5 categories is very deep with different types of internal credentials. If you review that AEL letter 0118, you can see in depth quite a bit of information on what actually counts for each of those and also what doesn't count for some of those. So I advise you to check that letter out to get the extreme detail there, and then of course always ask us if you have some doubts. Some key points about the post-secondary credentials. The main key point is it must be entered by the provider. So there's no data match like there is for high school equivalency. We do not data match with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. All credit and all earning of this credential is something that you, the provider, has to enter into TEAM. Before you enter it, you need to get proof of that credential though. So you have to get a transcript or get a copy of a certification from the individual, or develop it and pull it out of your data management system if you work at a community college, and then file that under the student's name in your filing system so that when you're monitored, that our monitors can see that you collected so many post-secondary credentials for performance, and then you have actual paper authentication of that credential that was earned. There's no requirement for the post-secondary credential to be employed within 4 quarters or to be enrolled in post-secondary education and training within 365 days like there is for the high school equivalency. And this is considered a post-exit measure. It's calculated after a participant exits. So to kind of review there, the credential attainment measure is a combination of post-secondary high school equivalency measures. It's one measure with 2 methods of achievement. So let's talk a little bit about who's in the credential for each of these measures or each of these methods for earning a credential attainment. In the secondary or the high school equivalency method, The students that are included in the denominator, which means all the students that are enrolled in your program that are going to count against that measure. They're individuals that do not have a high school equivalency or diploma when they begin your program, and then they either or at an ASC level 5 or 6 in all content areas, in all domains, or they take and pass at least one section of a high school equivalency exam, either Spanish or English. So that defines the denominator for high school equivalency. The taking and passing one section of the HSC exam allows for an ESL student, for example, to get in the denominator because they were identified as an ASC level, right? They will not be an ASC 5 or 6, but they may be an ESL level 3 or 4 or 2 or 1 or 5 or 6, and take a Spanish high school equivalency. And if they do that, then they're in the denominator. Same for English speakers. Sometimes a student may be at a level 4 and pass a section of a high school equivalency. That student also is going to be included in the measure. So it can either be 5 or 6 ASC level, or the individual takes and passes at least one section of an HSC exam. On the post-secondary denominator, for that method, it's all participants that are in an IET program. So if you have an IET program with 39 students, all 39 students are in the credential attainment measure because they've entered that measure by being in an IET. So some key points on the credential attainment measure. Again, it's calculated after exit from the POP, from the period of participation. And so that means that performance is not calculated till the program exits. And this is a good kind of image of showing you how this calculation works. So if the area on the left, the dark blue area, is the period of participation, and remember, credential attainment is a post-exit measure, so it's measured after the student exits for 365 days. So the student can earn the credential while they're in the POP or up to 365 days later. So that's how long the period of performance is for which an individual can learn and earn the high school equivalency. So they can exit your program and 4 or 5 months later get a high school equivalency, and it'll still count towards you for your performance. And that's why we call it a lag measure, because it can be up to a whole year later that this individual may show up in your performance. Remember, for the earning of the high school equivalency as part of credential attainment, they also have to become employed or enter post-secondary education in one of the 4 quarters following exit. So the individual is in your program, they earn a high school equivalency, they exit, and for a whole year, the individual must also enter employment or enter post-secondary education. And only when those things happen do you get performance for that high school equivalency. So it's a little bit higher bar. If the individual is already employed, they're going to show up, and that's fine. If they become employed in quarter 1 after exit and then they become unemployed, you're still going to get credit. If they enter post-secondary education, you're still going to get credit. That can be a training program, a college program. So we look for all of those criteria to happen. Most typically, it's the employment that we see happen for you to get a credential attainment award for that individual. This is one of the reasons why follow-up is very important, because when a student leaves your program, you're often out of sight, out of mind. You're not thinking about them anymore. But if they got a high school equivalency and you're counting on that to meet your performance, definitely you need to have a method in place for follow-up to make sure that the individual is either entering work or entering post-secondary education and training. And this is often a task that we hear career navigators do a very good job at. So some review again, kind of toggling between how does a credential count for a credential attainment part of our performance, and how does the high school equivalency count for measurable skills gain. As a credential, you can earn that credential attainment at any of the domains and at all levels, and they must pass a section of the HSC exam. It must be entered during participation or with 1 year after exit. Remember that. That's what we just went over. And then they must either be enrolled in post-secondary education within 365 days or employed in one of the 4 quarters following exit. And then as review for the HSC as a measurable skills gain, the participant can be at any level. They must earn the MSG during the program year for it to count for that program year. And there's no additional criteria. They don't have to become employed. They don't have to enter post-secondary education. So HSCs can count 2 different ways for you, but they have quite a bit of difference between what the methodologies are behind them. So let's do a little review. And I'll spend a little extra time in these. So if you're watching this by yourself or you're watching this with a group, you can kind of wait for the answer to come. So the first question is, true or false? There are 2 credential measures. This one's kind of a trick measure, or trick question. It's false. There's one measure that consists of 2 methods to earn it. One method is HSC achievement, and the other is a recognized post-secondary credential achievement. And the measure combines both of those into one measure. True or false? A participant can attain a credential performance by earning a Spanish high school equivalency. True. Spanish high school equivalency tests are allowable to earn a text chase and for AEL performance. Next question. Is the participant in the credential denominator after exit? Here we have to apply our understanding of the denominator. The participants at level 4 math and level 3 reading. The only test the participant takes during participation is the TABE test. The participant does not have an exclusionary reason at exit or within 90 days of exit. Exclusionary reasons are covered in our AEL letter 0118, and it essentially means the individual is not included in the measure. So what's the answer here? Are they in the denominator? No, they're not. This participant is not at HSC level in all domains, nor has he or she taken and passed a section of an HSC exam. Remember the denominator, they have to be at level 5 or 6 or take and pass one section of an HSC exam to be in the denominator. Here the student was at 3 and 4 levels and they only took a TABE test while they were in the program. Another question. Is the participant in the credential denominator after exit? The participant's at level 4 math and level 5 reading. The participant takes the math and reading section of the GED exam. He or she passes the reading section. The participant does not have an exclusionary reason at exit or within 90 days of exit. Are they in the denominator? The answer is yes. This participant has passed the reading section of the GED exam and thus is in the credential denominator upon exit. But to earn that performance, remember they must finish the HSC during participation or a year later and then become employed or enrolled in post-secondary education within a year after exit. Okay, here's another one. Is this participant in the credential denominator? Participants in an HSC prep program and meets the denominator for the credential, secondary credential. And then the participant is in an IET program. Yes, this participant is in the credential denominator and can earn the performance either as an HSC in their HSC prep class or as a post-secondary credential in the IET program. The performance is earned for either one of those, but they don't have to earn both of those to get performance. So they can earn their high school equivalency, but not finish the IET, and you would still get performance. And likewise, they may finish their IET, get a post-secondary credential, but they never get their HSC. And even though we hope that doesn't happen, it does happen, and you would still get positive credit though. If the credential is earned as an HSC, remember though, they must become employed or enrolled after exit in post-secondary education and training. Is this participant in the credential denominator? The participant enters with a high school equivalency test, so they come in with a high school equivalency, and then they enter an IET. And the answer here is yes. This participant is in the credential denominator because he or she is in the IET. So by being in that IET, even though they come in with a high school equivalency, they become part of the denominator because of that enrollment in the IET. So a little summary, there's one credential measure for credential attainment, but two methods to earn it, the high school equivalency method and the recognized post-secondary credential method. And the denominator for each of these is unique. High school equivalency can count towards both a type 2 MSG and for the credential attainment measure. Another thing to keep in mind is there's a wide variety of recognized post-secondary credentials for IET models. Check that AEL letter 0118, change 1 to really get a good review of those and ask AEL staff or send questions to the AELTA email box on credentials or any other type of guidance that you have questions about. This concludes the webinar. I want to invite you to check out our other webinars on the resources and webinar webpage, and don't hesitate to ask questions. We'd rather you spend as little time as possible worrying about or trying to figure something out when you can pick up the phone and give us a call or shoot us an email. Thank you very much. This concludes the webinar.